Somewhere in the Indian Ocean, buried under centuries of silt and coral, lies the skeleton of a ship that was supposed to make one man fabulously wealthy. Instead, it destroyed him. Now picture the map. Start in London. Trace a line south across the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean. That route, nearly 15,000 miles of open water, was the hunting ground assigned to one Captain William Kidd in 1696. He was given a brand new warship, a royal commission signed by King William III himself, and orders that seemed simple enough. Hunt down pirates, seize their plunder, bring it all back to England, and everyone gets rich. But now trace another line on that map, from the Indian Ocean north to Madagascar, and then watch the route stop, because that is where the Adventure Galley, one of the most advanced warships of its era, sat rotting in a shallow harbor, its hull eaten through by worms, its crew deserting, its captain stranded thousands of miles from home with stolen cargo, a murder charge hanging over his head, and powerful men in London already working to make sure he would never speak publicly about what really happened. Captain William Kidd did not set out to become a pirate. He set out to catch them. And the story of how a respected sea captain ended up watching his own ship sink beneath him while the men who sent him on the mission pretended they had never heard his name is one of the ugliest betrayals in maritime history. This is that story. To understand how William Kidd ended up stranded on a rotting ship in the middle of nowhere, you have to understand who he was before any of this started. And the truth is, he was nobody's idea of a pirate. By the early 1690s, Kidd was living in New York City. He had a wife named Sarah Bradley Cox Ort, a woman who had been widowed twice before marrying him, and who happened to own some of the most valuable real estate in Manhattan. Kidd himself owned property on Wall Street. He was a member of the city's social elite. He attended Trinity Church. He had dinner with colonial governors. By every measure that mattered in late 17th century New York, William Kidd was a respectable, successful man. He had also spent years as a legitimate privateer in the Caribbean, fighting the French during King William's War. Privateering was perfectly legal. The Crown issued commissions, essentially licenses, that authorized private ship captains to attack enemy vessels and keep a share of whatever they captured. It was piracy with paperwork. And Kidd was good at it. So when a group of powerful English nobles approached him in 1695 with a proposition, Kidd had no reason to be suspicious. The deal was straightforward. England had a pirate problem. French and English pirates were terrorizing the Indian Ocean trade routes, attacking ships belonging to the East India Company and the Mughal Empire. The Crown wanted someone to hunt them down, but here is where the arrangement got complicated. This was not a government-funded expedition. The men behind it were private investors. And not just any investors. The backers included some of the most powerful political figures in England. The Earl of Bellamont, who was about to become the governor of New York. The Earl of Orford, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty. The Baron of Romney, who was the Secretary of State. And several others whose names read like a roll call of the English aristocracy. These men did not want their involvement made public. The deal was structured so that Kidd would do all the sailing, all the fighting, and all the dying, if it came to that, while the investors sat in London collecting their share. Kidd was promised 10% of whatever he captured. The investors would split the rest. And if Kidd failed to capture anything of value, he would owe the investors the full cost of the expedition out of his own pocket. It was, on paper, a terrible deal. But Kidd took it anyway, because attached to the deal was something money could not buy. A privateer commission signed by King William III himself, granting Kidd authority to seize pirate vessels and French enemy ships anywhere in the world. That commission was supposed to be his shield. It was supposed to protect him from exactly the kind of trouble he was about to walk into. It did not. The ship they built for this mission was called the Adventure Galley, and for 1696 she was a serious piece of engineering. Built at the Castle Yard in Deptford along the Thames River, the Adventure Galley was a 284-ton galley frigate armed with 34 cannons. But what made her unusual was not the guns, it was the oars. The Adventure Galley was fitted with 46 oars, 23 on each side, which could be deployed when the wind died. In an era when becalmed ships were sitting ducks, this gave Kidd a massive tactical advantage. He could chase down any vessel regardless of wind conditions. She was fast, she was heavily armed, and she was built for exactly the kind of long-range hunting mission Kidd had been hired to do. There was just one problem. The ship was new, but the crew was not. Kidd left England in April 1696 with a partial crew and sailed to New York to recruit the rest. And this is where things started going sideways. The best sailors, the experienced privateers who knew what they were doing, were already employed. The men Kidd ended up recruiting in New York were, to put it bluntly, the leftovers, former pirates, deserters, men with nothing to lose and no loyalty to anyone. To make matters worse, the arrangement with these men was based on no prey, no pay. They did not receive salaries. They only got paid if Kidd captured something valuable, which meant that from the very first day, Kidd was captaining a ship full of desperate, broke men who would become increasingly angry if he failed to deliver plunder. And for months, he failed to deliver plunder. The Adventure Galley crossed the Atlantic, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and entered the Indian Ocean sometime in early 1697. And almost immediately, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. First, disease. The crew was hit by cholera during a stop in the Comoro Islands near Madagascar. A third of the crew died. Kidd was forced to spend weeks anchored there, burying men and trying to recruit replacements from the local population. Then, the hunting. Kidd spent months cruising the known pirate haunts and found almost nothing. The pirates he was supposed to be catching were either gone, better armed than he was, or sailing under the protection of local rulers who had no interest in helping an English privateer. Meanwhile, the Adventure Galley herself was starting to suffer. Tropical waters in the late 17th century were devastating to wooden ships. A species of saltwater clam called the Pterido nivalis, commonly known as the shipworm, was boring through the hull at an alarming rate. The Adventure Galley's bottom was being eaten alive. Water was seeping in. The pumps had to run constantly just to keep her afloat. So picture the situation. Kidd is thousands of miles from home. His crew is dying. His ship is leaking. He has captured nothing of value. And back in London, his investors are expecting a return on their money. The crew was getting restless. More than restless. They were on the edge of mutiny. And it was in this atmosphere of desperation and pressure that William Kidd made the decisions that would define his legacy forever. By mid-1697, Kidd had been at sea for over a year with nothing to show for it. No pirate prizes, no French captures, nothing. And every day that passed without plunder, the crew grew more dangerous. You have to understand what no prey, no pay actually meant on a ship like this. These men had left their lives behind. They had sailed halfway around the world. They had watched their friends die of cholera in the Comoros. They had pumped water out of a leaking hull in tropical heat for months. And they had not earned a single coin. Now picture being Kidd. You are standing on the quarterdeck of a deteriorating ship, commanding men who are openly talking about taking matters into their own hands. And then, in August 1697, a convoy of Mughal trading ships appears on the horizon near the coast of India. These were not pirate ships. These were not French ships. These were merchant vessels belonging to the Mughal Empire, one of England's most important trading partners. Attacking them would be an act of piracy, plain and simple. Kidd's crew did not care. They saw silk, spices, and gold floating past them, and they wanted it. The pressure on Kidd to attack was enormous. Some of the crew threatened open mutiny. Others simply glared at him with the kind of looks that tell a captain his authority is hanging by a thread. Kidd refused to attack the Mughal convoy. He held the line, but the damage was done. The crew now saw him as an obstacle standing between them and the money they believed they were owed. The most vocal of these men was a gunner named William Moore. Moore had been pushing Kidd for weeks to abandon the privateer commission and start taking whatever ships they could find. On October 30th, 1697, the confrontation reached a breaking point. Moore was on deck, grinding a chisel, when he made his feelings known one more time. He called Kidd a lousy captain. Some accounts say he accused Kidd of ruining them all, of being too cowardly to do what needed to be done. The argument escalated. Kidd, in a fit of rage, grabbed an iron-bound wooden bucket and smashed it into the side of Moore's head. Moore collapsed on the deck. He never regained consciousness. He died the following day. Whether this was murder or a captain enforcing discipline against a crewman who was actively inciting mutiny depends entirely on who you ask. In the 17th century, a captain's authority at sea was nearly absolute, and challenging that authority openly was understood to carry severe consequences. But the prosecution at Kidd's trial would strip away all that context and present the killing as cold-blooded murder. That bucket, that single moment of violence on a hot afternoon in the Indian Ocean, would follow William Kidd all the way to the gallows. But the real turning point came a few months later. In January 1698, the Adventure Galley intercepted a 400-ton Armenian merchant ship called the Quetta Merchant. She was loaded with satins, muslins, gold, silver, and opium. The cargo was worth somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 pounds, an almost unimaginable fortune at the time. Now here is the detail that would later save Kidd or condemn him, depending on who was telling the story. The Quetta Merchant was sailing under a French pass. This was a document issued by the French East India Company that granted the ship protection from French warships. And because England was at war with France, a French pass technically made the Quetta Merchant a legitimate target under Kidd's privateer commission. Kidd seized the ship. He kept the French passes as proof that the capture was legal. And he believed, genuinely believed, that he had done exactly what his commission authorized him to do. But the Quetta Merchant was not actually a French ship. She was owned by Armenian merchants, and her cargo belonged in part to a minister at the Mughal court. The seizure created an international incident. The Mughal emperor was furious. He threatened to shut down all English trade in India. The East India Company, which depended on Mughal goodwill for its entire business model, demanded that whoever was responsible be brought to justice immediately. And suddenly, the most powerful men in England needed a scapegoat. By the time Kidd reached Madagascar in April 1698, the Adventure Galley was finished. The shipworms had done their work. The hull was so compromised that the crew had to operate the pumps around the clock just to keep the ship from going under. Planks below the waterline were riddled with holes. The wood was soft and crumbling in places. Seams that had been caulked and recaulked were splitting open faster than they could be repaired. Kidd transferred everything of value, the cargo from the Quetta Merchant, the cannons, the stores, the rigging that could be salvaged, onto the Quetta Merchant herself. The Adventure Galley was stripped to her bones. Then he ordered what was left of the ship run aground in the shallows of St. Mary's Island, a small island off the northeast coast of Madagascar that served as a pirate haven. The Adventure Galley settled into the mud, her keel resting on the bottom, her masts still standing above the waterline like the ribs of a dead animal. The ship that had been built to hunt pirates was now rotting in a pirate harbor, and the situation on shore was just as grim. Nearly 100 of Kidd's crew deserted the moment they reached Madagascar. Many of them joined Robert Culliford, a well-known pirate captain who happened to be anchored at St. Mary's Island at the time. They took whatever they could carry from Kidd's cargo and walked away. Kidd was left with barely enough men to crew the Quetta Merchant. He was thousands of miles from home. His original ship was sinking into the mud behind him. The men who remained were loyal only because they had nowhere else to go. And the news filtering in from passing ships told him something that must have turned his blood cold. He had been declared a pirate. Back in London, the political winds had shifted completely. The Tory opposition was using Kidd's voyage to attack the Whig lords who had secretly backed the expedition. The same men who had signed Kidd's commission and funded his ship were now publicly denouncing him. They denied any connection to the venture. They called him a rogue and a criminal. The Earl of Bellamont, who had been one of the primary architects of the entire scheme, was now the man tasked with bringing Kidd to justice. He had no choice. If Kidd talked, if Kidd produced the documents showing exactly who had authorized the mission and who stood to profit from it, the political fallout would be catastrophic. Kidd had to be silenced, one way or another. Kidd made the decision to sail back to the Americas in the Quetta Merchant, hoping to negotiate his way out of trouble. It was a gamble born of desperation, but Kidd still believed he had one card left to play. The French passes. He was convinced that if he could present the French passes from the Quetta Merchant to the authorities, they would prove that his captures had been legal under the terms of his commission. He had followed the rules. He had checked the paperwork. The French passes made the seizure legitimate. In Kidd's mind, once he showed these documents to the right people, everything would be sorted out. What Kidd did not understand was that no one in London cared about the French passes anymore. The political calculus had changed completely. The Earl of Bellamont and the other Whig lords could not afford to have their names connected to Kidd's voyage. If it came out that senior members of the government had personally financed a privateer who was now being called a pirate, the political damage would be catastrophic. Kidd was no longer a privateer who had captured an enemy vessel. He was a liability, a loose thread that powerful men needed to cut before it unraveled everything. Kidd sailed the Quetta Merchant across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, through the Atlantic, and into the Caribbean. The voyage took months. Along the way, he would have heard news from passing ships, none of it good. His name was on wanted lists. The English government had issued a proclamation naming him as a pirate. Ships had been dispatched to hunt for him. He stopped at the island of Hispaniola, modern-day Dominican Republic, and Haiti, where he left the Quedagh Merchant and her remaining cargo with a local merchant named Henry Bolton, supposedly for safekeeping. The plan was to come back for it once his name was cleared. That never happened. The Quedagh Merchant was eventually burned and sunk at her moorings, and her remains were not positively identified until 2007, when underwater archaeologists from Indiana University found the wreck in shallow water off the coast of the Dominican Republic. But Kidd did not know any of that yet. He acquired a smaller, less conspicuous sloop called the Antonio and sailed north along the American coast toward New York. Along the way, Kidd began distributing pieces of his treasure to various contacts, hiding portions on Gardiner's Island off the eastern tip of Long Island and at other locations along the coast. He was trying to create leverage. If they arrested him, he would bargain with the location of the treasure. It was the only insurance policy he had left. The treasure on Gardiner's Island alone was later inventoried as including gold dust, silver bars, rubies, diamonds, and other precious stones. It was a substantial haul, but it was only a fraction of the Quedagh Merchant's full cargo. Where the rest ended up has been the subject of treasure hunting expeditions and wild speculation for over 300 years. In July 1699, Kidd arrived in Boston, where the Earl of Bellamont was waiting. Kidd sent letters ahead, trying to negotiate safe passage and a fair hearing. He still believed, even at this late stage, that he could talk his way out of trouble. That if the right people heard his side of the story and saw the French passes, they would understand. Bellamont responded with reassurances. "Come in," he told Kidd. "We can sort this out. Let us see your documents. You will get a fair hearing. It was a trap." On July 6, 1699, William Kidd was arrested in Boston. He was thrown into Stone Prison, one of the most miserable jails in the colonies. The conditions were deliberate. Kidd was placed in irons weighing over 16 pounds. He was kept in solitary confinement. He was denied adequate food, clean water, and legal counsel. Bellamont seized everything. The treasure from Gardiner's Island was recovered. Kidd's papers were confiscated, and here is the detail that seals the whole rotten story. The French passes, the documents that Kidd believed would prove his innocence, were taken from him and sent to London separately. Those passes disappeared. For over 200 years, historians debated whether the French passes ever existed. Kidd's defenders said they were real, and that Bellamont or the Whig lords had destroyed them to protect themselves. Kidd's accusers said he invented the story. Then, in 1911, an American researcher named Ralph Payne found the French passes in the Public Record Office in London. They had been there the entire time, misfiled and forgotten. The documents were exactly what Kidd had described. They proved that the Quedagh merchant had been sailing under French protection, which meant that Kidd's capture of the ship was, by the letter of his commission, perfectly legal. But by 1911, it was a bit late for William Kidd. Kidd was transported to England in early 1700 and held in Newgate prison for over a year before being brought to trial. During that time, he was kept in conditions designed to break him. His cell was cramped, dark, and filthy. He was denied meaningful access to lawyers. He was not allowed to review his own documents or prepare a proper defense. The message was clear. This was not a man the government wanted telling his story coherently in a courtroom. When the trial finally began on May 8, 1701, at the Old Bailey in London, the courtroom was packed. Kidd's case had become a political spectacle. The Tory opposition saw it as a chance to embarrass the Whig lords who had backed the expedition. The Whig lords saw it as something they needed to get over with as quickly and quietly as possible. Kidd faced two separate sets of charges. The first was the murder of William Moore, the gunner he had struck with the bucket nearly 4 years earlier. The second was 5 counts of piracy related to his seizure of various ships in the Indian Ocean, including the Quedagh merchant. Kidd's defense was straightforward, and under fair circumstances, it might have worked. On the murder charge, he argued that Moore was a mutinous crewman who had been openly defying his authority, and that the killing was an act of shipboard discipline, harsh but legally defensible under maritime law of the time. On the piracy charges, he argued that the Quedagh merchant had been sailing under French protection, which made her a legal prize under his privateer commission. But the French passes were not presented as evidence. They had been conveniently lost somewhere between Boston and London. Without them, Kidd had no documentary proof that the Quedagh merchant was a legitimate capture. His word alone was not enough. And then came the witnesses. Several of Kidd's former crewmen, men who had been offered full pardons in exchange for their testimony, took the stand and painted their former captain as a bloodthirsty pirate who had attacked innocent ships for personal gain. These were the same men who had pushed Kidd to attack, who had threatened mutiny when he refused, and who had deserted him in Madagascar to join Robert Culliford's crew. Now they sat in the witness box, pardoned and protected, telling the court exactly what the prosecution wanted them to hear. Kidd was not allowed to call witnesses of his own. He was not given adequate time to prepare cross-examinations. The trial moved at a speed designed to prevent him from mounting any meaningful defense. The proceedings lasted 2 days. The jury deliberated for barely an hour. William Kidd was found guilty of murder and on all 5 counts of piracy. The sentence was death by hanging. On May 23, 1701, William Kidd was taken from Newgate Prison and transported through the streets of London to Execution Dock at Wapping on the north bank of the Thames. This was the traditional execution site for pirates and maritime criminals, positioned at the water's edge so that the condemned could see the river and the ships that represented the world they were being punished for. A large crowd had gathered. Public hangings were entertainment in 18th century London, and Kidd's case had been front-page news for months. Street vendors sold pamphlets recounting his supposed crimes. Ballad writers had already composed songs about him. The man who walked to the gallows that morning was already becoming a legend, and he was not even dead yet. Accounts from the day describe Kidd as visibly drunk. Whether he had been given alcohol to keep him calm and compliant, or whether he had sought it out himself, is unclear. Either way, he was unsteady on his feet and reportedly struggled to speak coherently when given the opportunity to say his final words. Then the first attempt at hanging failed. The rope snapped and Kidd fell to the ground. In another era, some might have taken this as a sign of divine intervention, a suggestion that the execution was unjust. But this was Wapping in 1701, and nobody was in the mood for mercy. Kidd was hauled back up to the scaffold, a new rope was fitted, and the second time it held. After he was confirmed dead, Kidd's body was taken down and prepared for a final act of public humiliation. His corpse was coated in tar to slow decomposition and placed in a specially constructed iron cage called a gibbet. The gibbet was then hung from a wooden post at Tilbury Point at the mouth of the Thames, where it would remain for years. Every ship entering or leaving London would pass the decaying remains of Captain William Kidd, swinging in the wind and the rain. Sailors would see it from their decks. Passengers would point and stare. It was the Admiralty's version of a billboard. This is what happens to pirates. But Kidd was not just a warning to pirates. He was a warning to anyone who did business with powerful men and expected those men to keep their word when the consequences arrived. Meanwhile, back in Madagascar, the Adventure Galley continued its slow disintegration. After Kidd abandoned her in the shallows of St. Mary's Island, local scavengers stripped whatever the crew had left behind. Metal fittings, nails, anything that could be pried loose and repurposed. The masts eventually fell or were cut down. The hull, already riddled with worm damage, collapsed under its own weight as the timbers softened and split. Within a few years, the Adventure Galley was nothing more than a dark shape beneath the shallow waters of St. Mary's Harbor. Sand and silt covered what remained. Marine growth colonized the wreckage. By the mid-1700s, the ship had essentially disappeared, or so everyone thought. In 2000, an underwater archaeology team led by Barry Clifford announced that they had discovered the remains of the Adventure Galley in the waters off St. Mary's Island. The team reported finding cannons, hull timbers, and other artifacts consistent with a late 17th century warship. The announcement generated enormous excitement. The Adventure Galley was one of the most famous lost ships in pirate history, and finding her would be a major archaeological discovery. But the identification was almost immediately challenged. Other researchers pointed out that the site Clifford identified could also be the remains of several other ships that were known to have sunk in the same area during the same period. St. Mary's Island was a major pirate haven, and dozens of ships had been abandoned, scuttled, or wrecked in its waters over the centuries. The debate over whether Clifford actually found the Adventure Galley continues to this day. What is not in dispute is that the ship is down there somewhere in the warm, shallow waters off Madagascar, buried under 3 centuries of sediment. She was built to hunt pirates. She ended her days in a pirate harbor, and the man who commanded her died on a rope in London while the men who sent him on the mission pretended they had never heard his name. The story of William Kidd and the Adventure Galley is not really a pirate story. It is a story about power and about what happens to the people who carry out dirty work for powerful men. Kidd's investors were some of the most influential political figures in England. They designed the expedition to enrich themselves while exposing Kidd to all the risk. When the mission went sideways and created political problems, those same investors did not just abandon Kidd. They actively worked to destroy him. They suppressed evidence. They engineered his trial. They made sure he would never have a platform to tell his side of the story. The French passes tell you everything you need to know. These documents, which prove that Kidd's most controversial capture was legal, were taken from him, hidden in a government archive, and not rediscovered for over 200 years. Kidd went to the gallows without the one piece of evidence that might have saved his life. And the men who took those documents from him? They kept their titles, their estates, and their reputations. Not one of them faced any consequences for their role in the affair. The Adventure Galley herself is almost too perfect a metaphor. A powerful ship built for a specific purpose, sent into hostile waters with inadequate support, and then left to rot when the mission failed. That is not just the story of a ship. That is the story of every person who has ever been used as a tool by someone more powerful and then discarded when they became inconvenient. Kidd was no saint. The killing of William Moore, whatever the circumstances, was an act of violence that cost a man his life. And Kidd's judgment in the Indian Ocean was, at best, questionable. He made decisions under pressure that a more cautious captain might have avoided. But the question that has followed this story for more than 300 years is not whether Kidd was a good man. The question is whether he was a pirate. And the evidence, including the evidence his own government hid from the jury that convicted him, suggests that the answer is far more complicated than the men who hanged him wanted anyone to believe. The Adventure Galley sits on the bottom of a harbor in Madagascar. William Kidd's body hung in a cage at the mouth of the Thames until the flesh fell from his bones. And somewhere in the archives of the British government, the French passes that could have changed everything gathered dust for 2 centuries. That is the story of Captain Kidd. Not a pirate tale, a political execution dressed up as justice, and a ship that carried a doomed man across 15,000 miles of ocean, only to die in the same harbor where his mission, his reputation, and his life all fell apart. If this story hit different, subscribe. Every week we cover the real stories behind history's most infamous ships, captains, and voyages. The ones where the truth is uglier and more interesting than the legend. And if you want to see how another captain got set up by the same kind of powerful men, that video is on screen right now.